أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
Hi, and welcome back to Universal Unity. So it was Pride Week, and there was a lot of talk about homosexuality, gay marriage, things like that. Whenever the topic of homosexuality does come up, religion is always discussed as well. What I'll be focusing mainly on this video is what the Quran has to say about homosexuality, and whether or not someone can identify themselves as a homosexual and also call themselves a submitter or a Muslim. So with Muslims, generally you'll see a few types of people when it comes to talking about homosexuality. You have the extreme Muslims who will say homosexuals need to be hung, stoned, or some extreme and unusual cruel form of punishment. And then there are the Muslims who just don't really know much about the topic, what Quran has to say. They only really know what they've heard, that it's taboo, against God's teachings, but they don't really know what God's teachings actually are. For the record, there is no punishment in the Quran for being a homosexual. There is only punishment for adultery, which is having sex outside of marriage. And more recently, since the commercialization of religion, there have been Muslims, scholars who've been coming out and saying things like, no, it's okay to be gay and a Muslim. You can still identify as a homosexual and still be a Muslim. Some have even said there's nothing wrong with the marriage between same-sex couples. And this is not just Muslims, but also Christians, Catholics. Some are kind of coming out and saying, no, it's totally okay. God doesn't say anything against it. But what does the Quran actually say about homosexuality? There's a lot of talk about religion and homosexuals, but what does the Quran actually have to say? And when most Muslims talk about homosexuality, the most popular story, even amongst Christians and Catholics, is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. You see, Lot went to his people preaching about God alone, and this city rejected him, and they were committing many vices, among which was homosexuality. Chapter 7, verse 80. Lot said to his people, "You commit such an abomination, no one in the world has done it before. You practice sex with the men instead of the women. Indeed, you are a transgressing people." His people responded by saying, "Evict them from your town. They are people who wish to be pure." Consequently, we saved him and his family, but not his wife. She was with the doomed. We showered them with a certain shower. Note the consequences for the guilty. So many Muslims or Christians, or if anyone who follows the religion of Abraham, they cite this story and they say, well, look, these guys were destroyed for being homosexuals. But it was not their only vice. Chapter 29, verse 28 to 29. Lot said to his people, "You commit an abomination. No one in the world has ever done it before. You practice sex with the men. You commit highway robbery, and you allow all kinds of vice in your society." The only response from his people was to say, "Bring to us God's retribution if you are truthful." So you see, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were committing many more vices, which ultimately led to their destruction. The liberal Muslims will take this story and say, well, look, see, their only vice wasn't homosexuality, so they weren't destroyed just for being gay. And nor in the Quran does it say you cannot be gay. So they play around with this a little bit. They kind of come and say, well, look, see, homosexuality isn't forbidden in the Quran. And while it is true that God does mention that they committed more than one major vices, they committed a whole bunch, what's noteworthy is that of all these vices, God chooses to talk about homosexuality the most. In fact, God only mentions that they committed other vices only once. And another noteworthy thing to mention is that God himself calls this an abomination. Chapter 21, verse 74. As for Lot, we granted him wisdom and knowledge, and we saved him from the community that practiced abominations. They were wicked and evil people. So to dispel any doubts about whether or not the Quran prohibits homosexuality, I'd like to share the following verses. Chapter 7, verse 81. You practice sex with the men instead of the women. Indeed, you are a transgressing people. Chapter 27, verse 55. You practice sex with the men lustfully instead of the women. Indeed, you are an ignorant people. Note how God calls them ignorant and transgressing for practicing homosexuality. Okay, so homosexuality goes against the teachings of the Quran. So what does this mean for homosexuals? Does God condemn all homosexuals? Very valid question. And if you go over the verses again, you'll notice that God condemns the act or the practice of homosexuality. Chapter 7, verse 81. You practice sex with the men instead of the women. Indeed, you are a transgressing people. Chapter 27, verse 55. You practice sex with the men lustfully instead of the women. Indeed, you are an ignorant people. Chapter 21, verse 74. As for Lot, we granted him wisdom and knowledge, and we saved him from the community that practiced abominations. They are wicked and evil people. Chapter 7, verse 80. Lot said to his people, you commit such an abomination. You commit such an abomination. No one in the world has done it before. So God is not going to punish you or hold you accountable just for having these homosexual thoughts, feelings, desires. What God does forbid is the actual practice of homosexuality. The only time a person can relieve themselves sexually is lawfully with their spouse whom they are lawfully married to. Chapter 23, verse 6. Only with their spouses or those who are rightfully theirs do they have sexual relations. They are not to be blamed. And to clear any thoughts or questions about whether or not your spouse has to be of the opposite sex, I share with you the following verses. Chapter 16, verse 72. And God made for you spouses from among yourselves, and produced for you from your spouses children and grandchildren, and provided you with good provisions. Should they believe in falsehood and turn unappreciative of God's blessings? Chapter 35, verse 11. God created you from dust, then from a tiny drop. Then he causes you to reproduce through your spouses. No female becomes pregnant, nor gives birth without his knowledge. No one survives for a long life, and no one's life is snapped short, except in accordance with the pre-existing record. This is easy for God to do. Chapter 2, verse 221. Do not marry idolatresses unless they believe. A believing woman is better than an idolatress, even if you like her. Nor shall you give your daughters in marriage to idolatrous men unless they believe. A believing man is better than an idolater, even if you like him. These invite to hell, while God invites to paradise and forgiveness, as he wills. He clarifies his revelations for the people, that they may take heed. There are many more examples and verses throughout the Quran where God talks about marriage and it being between a man and a woman. This is how God intended it to be. This is his design. Okay, so homosexuality is forbidden, but what is a homosexual person supposed to do? Why would God create somebody with homosexual desires and then forbid them from carrying out these desires? This is a very valid question and quite a famous argument. And the answer to this question lies within dispelling this false notion that God creates somebody as a homosexual. Lust is just a desire through which we are tempted. This life is a test, and this test is filled with many temptations. We always have a choice between choosing God or Satan. Satan tests us with various desires. Money, power, fame, property, you name it. Heterosexuals also have these desires through which Satan tempts them. Just because a heterosexual man or a woman has a lustful desire towards another person of the opposite sex does not necessarily mean that they love that person. It's just their lustful desire. Similarly, just because a homosexual has these desires towards somebody of the same sex does not mean that they genuinely love that person. People get lust and love confused all the time, so much so that it's become a cliche. Someone will be so sure at the time that they genuinely love this person, but later on come to the conclusion that it was just lust. When it comes to love, God is the one who puts love in your heart for other people. Satan may try and trick us into thinking that we actually love someone or something. Chapter 30, verse 21. Among his proofs is that he created for you spouses from among yourselves, in order to have tranquility and contentment with each other. And he placed in your hearts love and care towards your spouses. In this there are sufficient proofs for people who think. So in conclusion, a man or a woman would never truly have love in their hearts for somebody of the same gender, at least not the same kind of love that you would for a spouse. Nor would God advocate vice by creating somebody as a homosexual and then hypocritically forbidding them from marriage. These lusts are only temporary desires and temptations by Satan in hopes that we stray from God's path. If we persevere and choose God, like many other tests, once we've completed them, God will remove this test from us. So that's all the Quran really has to say about homosexuality, same-sex marriage, whether or not somebody can call themselves a Muslim and still identify as a homosexual. I hope you learned something. That's all for now, so God bless and peace be upon you.
لا إله إلا الله